as we're going on, but more than likely the last Saturday of the month, men's breakfast, and he will let us know where that's going to be. We're doing a series at the moment called Hope and Doubt. Hope and doubt. And the two words simply do not seem to fit in the same sentence, do they? Doubt comes with fear and trepidation and anxiety. I mean, doubt comes with these things. We struggle when we deal with doubt. If you've ever been somewhere and someone says, hey, this is what you need to do, and that doubt starts creeping in, it's not a good place. And yet we can say there has to be hope and doubt. And the reality is, as we talk about our faith, we go, hope and doubt in our faith, they just don't go together. Now, as we go through this series, I hope you understand, our goal is not to promote doubt, it's to give place and permission and hope when we doubt. If you've ever been a follower of Jesus Christ for very long, you know this. Hard times come, and there's things that will set you off where you begin to go, I don't understand. My grandparents grew up at a certain time of history that most of us cannot fully grasp. My grandparents grew up in the Great Depression, and probably yours did too. Some of you may have had parents who came up through the Great Depression. One of the things about my grandparents is that growing up through this era, and I say grow up, they kind of hit that period, young adult, teenage, young adult, young married couple through that time. When they were trying to set up a house, have kids, one thing that it did to them is that it changed them. If you ever met someone who came up through the Great Depression, there was something that sort of just said, let's not waste anything. Now, some of you guys may not have had parents who came through the Great Depression or grandparents, but some of you may have had parents or grandparents who just came through some very tough times. One of the things my grandparents did that took me forever, and I could never understand it, is that they would save all their butter containers. You know, the margarine plastic. My grandmother would save every margarine container, and she would use them as freezer containers. Grandpa would go out fishing, and she would take those fish, and she would cut them up and stick them in those containers, fill it up with water, and she would put them in her fridge. She did not own Tupperware. She did not waste her money on Tupperware. She had butter containers. And so when you went to her house and you opened up the fridge and she said, go get this out of the fridge, you go, but what container? They all look the same. And it's starting to open up the container. My grandmother did not waste plastic bread bags. You know your bread comes in plastic bags? My grandmother would take those bread bags and she would wash them out. And by the way, she did not buy that many loaves of bread. She made her own loaves of bread, but when she did buy a loaf of bread, that bag remained, and another one of her loaves of bread went back into that loaf of bread. In fact, when I stayed with my grandmother, when I was in college, started college, I would go to my grandmother's and stay there for the summer vacation. You know what my lunch went to work with me in? A bread bag. My grandmother never bought Ziploc baggies, but if anything came in a Ziploc baggie, you know what she did with it? She washed it out and she reused it. And by the way, do you know how many times you can use a Ziploc baggie? A long time. My grandmother and my grandfather, they gardened their whole life. They only stopped gardening because they physically could not get in the garden any longer. My grandmother would can not my one grandmother, both of my grandparents would can vegetables or freeze vegetables every year. By the way, they were so good. You did not waste anything. In fact, clothes, going to buy new clothes, my grandmother was still wearing clothes when I met her, and when I would go stay with her in the early 90s, she was still wearing clothes from the 1960s. And it's not because my grandmother didn't have enough money to go buy clothes, but why do you waste clothes? And by the way, if you've ever bought any clothes from the 60s, you can still wear them because they didn't wear out. And they're actually kind of fashionable today, by the way. They're kind of cool. And if they did happen to wear out, my granddad, both of my grandparents, but my one granddad always wore overalls. My other granddad always wore a green pair of, they had one outfit. My one granddad wore a green shirt and a green pair of pants. He did own a fuel station for a while. And then my other granddad, he was a farmer and worked in a factory. And he just wore overalls. You wore one pair of overalls until it wore out, and then you bought another pair of overalls, and you did not throw away the old pair of overalls. It had a purpose either in a quilt, in pot holders, in something. You could turn a pair of old overalls into I don't know how many things. If you ever had a parent or a grandparent who came through the Great Depression, you know they never wasted anything. I want you to just hang on to that thought a moment because we're going to come back to it. I'm just going to go totally off, okay? I want you to hold on to that. As we've been talking about the idea of faith and the hope that we can have in faith, there is this thing that we've been talking about that tells us that we can begin to have hope partly because we have a Savior who understands what we go through. We looked at last week, and by the way, as we're going through the series, doubt is going to come. Don't stop and look at this and say, hang on, I don't doubt. I have so much faith. My faith is so strong. And by the way, I've met some amazing people through my life, and almost everyone I know will go through at least one time in their life that we call it the dark night of the soul. Something so tragic, so unbelievably out of character that you just go, I don't understand it. And we began to say this, that the reality is that the doubts that we face in our lives is not an intellectual issue. Most of us are convinced we know that God came in flesh. Most of us are convinced that we have a Savior who died on a cross and rose again for our sins. We don't doubt the intellectual. There is so much evidence for Him that we don't sit and doubt it from an intellectual perspective. Where our doubts come from is more of an emotional need. We doubt and we struggle because something comes into our life that does not make sense, because we believe that God is in total control and that God is sovereign. And so if something happens in our life, we ask a basic question: God, why? God, why me? God, why now? God, why? If you are in control, if you can, why? And so we begin to deal with this idea that there is a God who loves us, and we hold on to that because He died for us. But if He loves us and He could do something about this and He didn't, why? The doubts that we struggle with and the doubts that we face is not an intellectual issue. And by the way, if you are struggling with doubt from an intellectual perspective, there is so much information that is out there that deals with who He was and the proof of who He was. Instead, for most of us, we're going to struggle with and we're going to deal with doubt, and it is going to come at a time in your life, and you're only going to be able to say, God, why? And it is in this moment that I want to stop and to say there is hope. And hope comes from, number one, He cares. He's been there. He has not abandoned you. And He knows what you're going through. Now, that's a good start. But there's more. I always love those TV commercials. It slices, it dices. But wait, there's more. I'll sell it to you for a good bargain. $15.99 for you, Rusty. But there's more. There's a place in our life where we begin to understand he doesn't just care. There's not just hope because he hasn't abandoned us, but there's a greater hope, and we're going to begin to deal with it. Now, as we start to deal with this today, I want to start with a basic idea. When we begin to deal with doubt, one of the problems that we struggle with is we start with this idea, and it turns from not just a question of why, God, why haven't you done something, but we turn to the God, why have you caused something? Now, before we go any farther, I want to start here. When we begin to talk about the trials and the troubles that come into our life, where do they come from? I want to start by saying this. We do not serve a God who is like the old Greek gods who used to stand in heaven with the lightning and the thunderbolts and begin to throw them out at people. As you begin to go through the troubles that you will go through, as you begin to deal with trials that only you will have to go through, as you begin to deal with things that we cannot explain, can I just stop and say this? Do not see God as someone in heaven who stops with a lightning bolt and stops and he says, oh, I see Bob. I got a good one for Bob. Watch this. Rusty, I know where Rusty's. I got a little one for Rusty right here. Okay. When we begin to deal with the troubles we go and we deal with, understand this. God does not sit in heaven with thunderbolts and lightning trying to zap his children. I want to start with this. In James chapter 1, verse 13, James, Jesus' half-brother, writes something that I think is so important for us to understand. He says this, and remember when you are being tempted, do not say God is tempting me. God is never tempted with wrong or tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. And then he goes down to verse 16, a couple verses later, and he says this, whatever is good and perfect is a gift coming down to us from God our Father, who created all the lights in heaven. He never changes or he casts a shifting shadow. James begins to deal with this idea that God is not someone who sits in heaven desiring to cast lightning bolts and thunder on those that are unsuspecting. God's desire for us is good. So if God's desire is good for us, why do we deal with what we do? And that doesn't help the why question, then does it? God, if, then why? We know this. If God is not the author of troubles, they've got to be coming from somewhere. I'm going to start real quickly, and I'm going to have to move very fast today, and I don't have as much time to get into as much as I want to, but I want to stop and deal with this. There are three areas. When troubles come into our lives, they basically come from three different places, and you're familiar with all three. The first place where troubles and trials come in our life is from, okay, let's put it up there. They come from us, right? Oh, I might have gotten you off into, okay. I'm going to give you this verse before I give it, okay. I like this verse. Ultimately, the evil comes into our life, not from God, but from someone who wants to destroy your life. Jesus was giving an illustration about sheep and shepherds, and in that day, a lot of the people that he was dealing with had flocks around their houses. You raised a couple sheep because that was your meat during certain times of the year. You bought sheep in order to slaughter so you could go sacrifice it in the temple. They were very familiar with sheep. And so he stops and he says this, you understand what it's like to have a shepherd, and you know what sheep are like. And he says this, the shepherd looks after his sheep and he cares for and he loves his sheep. But he says there is somebody who comes who is not concerned with the sheep. It's the thief. And the thief's purpose is to steal, kill, and destroy. My purpose is that you might have a rich and satisfying life. Okay, so where do these problems come from? Number one, they start sometimes within us. Now, we could go and look at some verses that God, but we don't need to do that because you know this yourself. There are times we do things that we wish we did not do. Aren't there? Aren't there things when you say, I know I shouldn't do it, but oh, it feels so good to do it. You ever been in one of those arguments with your spouse and a real zinger comes up and you know you shouldn't say it, but you guys have never been there. Or maybe that means the silence is you have been there a little too often. See, the problem is this. We know a lot of the troubles that come into our life, they start with, and James even talks about that earlier, they start from within and they come out from within. So a lot of the trials, and be careful, not all the troubles and the trials that come into our life are our fault. You know that. But we also must take responsibility for the ones that are our fault. Okay. Number two, troubles and trials come into our lives because you married someone. I didn't say that, did I? It's someone else's fault. Honestly, troubles and trials come into our lives not just because of what I do or what we do ourselves. Sometimes troubles come into our lives because we live with other people who do wrong things. You ever been involved in an accident where somebody drank when they shouldn't have drunk? You ever went somewhere and you didn't do anything, but you became responsible for someone else's irresponsibility? We all deal with this. This is just a part of life, and we sometimes find ourselves dealing with other people's irresponsibility. One person's responsibility is usually the result of someone else's irresponsibility. Number three, we sometimes deal with troubles and trials in our life, not just because of what we do, sometimes not just because of what others do, but because of something else we're all familiar with. We live in a broken world. We live in a society and a world that is affected by decisions that someone by the name of Adam made long, long ago. He set in motion a world that is physically hurt and broken and dying. And by the way, one of the reasons why I really hate missing this Tuesday night is because I really want to talk about what sin does in general to where we live. Maybe we'll get that next week. We'll see. But we live in a broken world, and you simply sometimes cannot avoid hurricanes happening. Bushfires happening. You cannot avoid getting sick. Health issues, heartbreak, that has nothing to do with someone else's wrong. It has to do with a broken world we live in, and we have to deal with a broken world. You see, here's the thing. As we talk about the troubles we go through, you will not escape. In fact, Jesus made it very clear, in this world you will have trouble. But I'm with you. Okay. You will have trouble. You will not avoid it because it just follows us around. Something I want to remind us of, before we go on, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 45, Jesus talks about his character. And as we continue on, as we look at the idea of the hope that we can have in doubt and the troubles that we face, we need to look at his character. And Jesus reminds us of something that you need to hold on to. It doesn't look like much. It doesn't sound like much. But Jesus said this, "For he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends his rain on the just and the unjust alike." Okay. What does he mean by that? Jesus reminds us that everything that we have, all of the blessings that we sometimes overlook, he gave out to all. When it rains, now we talk about when it rains, it pours, and we think of it as a bad thing. This was not intended as a bad this was intended as it rains, it waters the ground, it provides crop and food for life. The sun comes out and just gives, it's God's goodness that was desired for all. But the reality is, just as God's blessing was intended for all, the broken world we live in also affects all. God's goodness was intended for all, but hard times also come to all. Which always causes us to ask the question, why do bad things happen to good people? We never ask the question, why do good things happen to bad people? And Jesus starts by saying it's an irrelevant question. That's not what this is about. Good and bad are going to come into all of our lives. Good's going to come because he intended good for us. Bad is going to come because we live in a broken world and there is a thief who comes to steal, kill, and to destroy. And so where does that find us, those of us who say we follow Jesus Christ? Paul begins to give us an idea of how we can have hope and doubt. In the book of Romans, we started last week looking at the book of Hebrews. Book of Romans was written somewhere AD 50, about 3 years after Roman Nero's reign. Remember last week we looked at Nero? Nero started off as a pretty decent ruler. When Paul wrote the book of Romans, he was writing to a group of Christians who were under Nero's reign, but at this time, they have relatively peace and safety in Rome. In Jerusalem, though, there has been a battle against Christianity going on. So at the time that Paul is writing the book of Romans, a lot of these Christians have left other parts of the world. They have ended up in Rome mostly as economic refugees. What was happening in Jerusalem is that the Pharisees and those who were against Christianity were beginning to stop and imprison and remove housing. They were beginning to remove the privileges that they had as Jewish people. And so in order to survive, they began to head to Rome to make work, to find work. Rome was the big city. The only problem is that as they began to, as they were headed into Rome, Rome was not an easy place. Being a refugee, being an immigrant from a place that you're not familiar with and showing up in other places was not easy, and they had to try to make a go of it. And as this group of Christians began to get together, there were struggles, not persecution in a sense from Nero. Nero wasn't bothering them at this time. Instead, the way Paul writes this, we understand it was probably more having to do with the common problems we all face. Maybe they couldn't find housing. Maybe they couldn't find work. Maybe they were struggling with children being sick, they didn't have money for clothing, they were maybe struggling to, we don't know what the problem was. But Paul begins to write them, and he begins to deal with this idea that says, hang on, you need to understand there is hope in our hardest times. In Romans chapter 8, verse 18, he begins to make this little statement, which sounds trivial, but it's pretty big. He says this, yet what we suffer now is nothing compared to the glory he will reveal to us. Yet what we suffer now, it's nothing compared to the glory which will be revealed in us later. He says it's temporary. You can't find a house now. It's okay, because one day you will be given a house that will last for an eternity. You're struggling to buy food for your family. It's all right. Hang on. You will one day have more than you will ever be able to eat. You're struggling with sickness. That's okay, because one day you will have a body that won't grow sick. And he stops and he says, it's okay. You need to understand, hold in the back of your mind real quickly, what you struggle with now is but for a moment when compared to an eternity. All right, this sounds good, but Paul knew the same as what I know, is that all those little small struggles that we deal with, they really may be insignificant in the whole scheme of life, but let's be honest, they begin to wear us out. I mean, struggle after struggle after struggle. If it's just one, we can deal with it, can't we? But when you have you ever woken up in the middle of the night with a little mosquito just buzzing around your ear? It's only a little mosquito. It can't drink that much blood. You're going to be fine. But can you sleep with that mosquito buzzing around your ear? It will wear you out. And in a sense, as Paul's reminding them of the struggles that they are about to face, though they are minor, he also knows this. Constant struggle will wear you out. It begins to create a division between you and your Savior. So he continues to move on. And he begins to stop and he says this. There is a hope that you can have in your hard times. And here's the main point. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know this, that God causes everything to work together for the good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. Paul tells them this, though God does not bring the hard times into their lives, he will not waste the hard times that they go through. What? We can have hope and doubt because though God may not bring the hard times in our life, he will not waste the hard times in our life. He intends for something good. He allows for something good to be a part of the hard times that we go through. What does that mean? It means sometimes we need to get our eyes up off of where we're at now and look up. The struggles that we deal with, though we cannot understand or explain or know why we go through them, God says it doesn't matter. And by the way, as you read this verse, do not read, and we know that all things work together for good, or that all things are good. He does not say that all things are good. He says that all things work for good. All things that you are going through in your life are not good. All the things, all the struggles that you deal with are exactly that. They are struggles, and some of the struggles are caused by mistakes I've made. Some of the struggles that we go through are just because of a mistake someone else made that is now affecting my life. Some of the problems and the struggles we're going through is simply because we live in a broken world and a storm comes in and it does something that I cannot control. And Paul reminds us, don't give up there is hope, because he will not waste that moment, but will allow it to produce something good. All right, I'm looking at my time and I've got to finish. So here's the main point I want you to hold on to. We can have hope because God will not waste your struggle. He will not waste your hardships, but will turn them into good if we allow them. That's easy for me to say on Sunday morning, by the way. It's not always so easy on Monday morning, and I know this. There are times when Monday morning comes and the struggles that we all have to deal with sounded good on Sunday. But when you're on Monday knowing you have to wait till Friday to see the good, it doesn't sound so good. Paul is reminding us, hang on, hold on. We started off by saying this. We had grandparents who did not waste anything. Can I say this? Some of the best moments of my life were moments when I went to my grandparents' house. The value that they placed, and by the way, my grandparents were some of the most generous, loving. I mean, literally, if there was anything that we ever needed, my grandparents would give the shirts off their back to help you out. What the struggles they went through did not create in them people who were bitter and upset. It created people who were loving, who were generous, who did not waste their lives. What are you going through? I'm not here to tell you this morning that the struggle you're going through is easy. I wouldn't do that. In fact, I'll be quite honest with you. Some of the struggles that I know some of you are going through, all I can do is say, God, I don't understand how they're doing it. I don't understand why you allow that. And by the way, there are things and times, and I don't get it. But God will not waste the struggles that you go through if you give them to Him. You got two choices. We can stop and we can allow doubt to come into our life, and we can allow that doubt to control our minds. And by the way, doubt will come. I'm not trying to say it won't. It will come. But in that moment when doubt raises its head, you have a moment and a choice to say, God, I'm going to choose to give this to you and allow you to do something with it. Or you can choose to allow doubt to hold on. I'm not saying you'll ever understand. I don't know. Sometimes when Friday comes, we can look back and go, God, all I can do is say, thank you for turning that into something good. Some things in my life, I've just raised my hand up and say, God, I don't know why it come. But may it allow me to be more patient, more loving, more kind. I don't know. There's things I would love to go back and change. I cannot. God, don't waste my mistakes. Don't waste my problems. Don't waste my struggles. Instead, may you get glory out of it.